The Forbidden City, the largest palace on Earth in the heart of Beijing. To the emperors of China, this was the center of the world. On New Year's Day, 1421, this architectural wonder was unveiled in a grand opening ceremony by the great Ming Emperor, Yongle.
It's very hard to walk through the main gate without being in utter awe of that man.
Set on 180 acres and with 9,000 rooms, the Forbidden City hailed its creator, the Emperor Yongle, as the supreme ruler of all China. He forged his great vision from timbers felled thousands of miles from Beijing and giant slabs of marble hauled across ice. The emperor marshaled 1 million people to build a palace that would last 1 million generations.
They paid homage to His Majesty, the one true Son of Heaven.
But Yongle had no right to call himself emperor, no right to build a palace of his own. It was raised on the blood of others. This warlord had clawed his way to the top, fought foul, betrayed his own family, killed all in his path to steal the throne. Everything to prove that he was heaven's chosen agent on Earth. But now, as the world's eyes turn to Beijing, long-forgotten chronicles from the Ming era have been translated into English for the first time. They tell how he constructed a gilded prison, stocked with exotic concubines, policed by eunuchs, and rife with greed, treachery, and danger.
Your only duty is to love me.
But this closeted world would be shaken by a murder so monstrous that it provoked the vengeance of heaven.
Has my rule gone astray?
Has my rule gone astray?
Has my rule gone astray?
This Crimson Palace, the heart of Beijing, has hidden its dark secrets for far too long. It is September 1424, and the Forbidden City is shrouded in darkness. The entire court is in mourning. The Emperor Yongle is dead. In a dimly lit hall, the Emperor's most trusted servant, the eunuch Hai Shu, has come to dress his master in his funereal robes. Tomorrow, at first light, the body will be interred in the great Ming tombs outside the city. Tucked away in the opulent quarters of the imperial harem is one of the exquisite women who warmed the emperor's bed, the concubine, Lady Cui. She is making herself beautiful for her husband one last time, for his funeral. And in a dank prison just outside the palace walls, China's Minister of Revenue, Xia Yuanji, incarcerated for offending the emperor, is still reeling from the news of Yongle's death. Each knew the emperor intimately. Each took the chilling story of Beijing's bloody beginnings to their grave. But there is a way to give them back their voice. Chinese specialists at Cambridge University have combed the long-neglected chronicles of the Ming dynasty to dig out their tale. Hardly any of these ancient texts have ever been translated into modern Mandarin, let alone English. Now, at last, they have. And it is their words that after 6 centuries will breathe life back into these 3 very real members of Yongle court.
I'm looking at one of the closing chapters in a text called The Ming Veritable Records. It's one of the closing chapters for the reign of Yongle, and it incorporates an account, an abbreviated account, of the circumstances of his death and the mourning that followed his death. And it includes a very moving, evocative eulogy. 大略修理精密之人，善人时
On the outside,
雄称
you were severe, strict even. But on the inside, you were benevolent and kind. Brave, certainly. Courageous, of course. A talent for the most cunning of strategies. You undoubtedly knew how to get the most out of people.
It was this combination of severity and benevolence, this balance, that made him an effective military and civil leader.
But what I remember most about you, my emperor, my lord, is that you went far, far beyond the ordinary. You could not abide mediocrity. Nothing in your life could hold you back.
The eunuch Haishu was right. Yongle had let nothing stand in the way of his lifelong obsession to make the Chinese Empire a world superpower. And at its heart was his grand palace, the Forbidden City.
This building still stands today as the symbol of the Chinese people and their great and glorious history. Only someone who had overweening power and overweening pride could bring such a vision to completion.
As many as 100,000 tourists pour through the gates from Tiananmen Square every day to marvel at the fairy tale world of the emperors. But the Forbidden City is more than a multicolored candy box. Yongle, the man who built it, was never chosen to be emperor. The palace is steeped in the blood of the thousands he killed to steal the throne. When he started out, the capital of China wasn't in Beijing, but 550 miles to the south, in the city of Nanjing. "30 years earlier, in 1393, Yongle was just a prince in the imperial family. The fledgling Ming dynasty faced a crisis. His eldest brother, the heir to the throne, had unexpectedly died. Their father, the emperor, had summoned his remaining sons to the imperial palace in Nanjing. Yongle, then known as the Prince of Yen, was now the emperor's eldest surviving son. A war hero, for years he had successfully defended the northern reaches of China from the Mongols, the empire's greatest enemy. This warrior prince felt certain that his father, the emperor, would now reward his military prowess and proclaim him his successor. But there was another claimant to the throne, the emperor's eldest grandson, the 15-year-old Qian Wen. Qian Wen was not like his uncle the prince. He had never seen battle. He was far happier, his nose buried in a book. But the rules of succession had been laid down. The throne must pass from firstborn son to firstborn son. The emperor made his decision. He chose his grandson over the prince.
He had no right to the throne. He knew that he had no right. And when his father went on to pass the empire down from his eldest son to his eldest son, his grandson, who was just a young man, completely untrained and inexperienced, I think he sensed a tremendous sense of loss.
This deep sense of loss would push Yongle down a new road that would lead all the way to the Forbidden City. He returned to the far northern town of Beiping to lick his wounds. He'd run his own fiefdom from here since he was 10 years old. This was his power base. Yongle was furious. According to the Ming Chronicles, he believed his father had not just chosen a weak successor, he had broken a promise.
These are words that the Prince of Yen's father allegedly said about the prince. Of all the princes, there's none who equals the Prince of Yen, for he is the most benevolent and filial. It is my preference that he be chosen.
Jules?
My father promised me the throne. My son is worthy, enlightened, benevolent, generous. He's also brave and martial like I. That's what he said!
All the angry prince needed now was the spark to convince him to seize the throne for himself. He didn't have long to wait. One account tells that a soothsayer had been summoned to the tavern. He foretold that one day soon the prince would be emperor. It was a prophecy remembered long after by Yongle's most loyal servant, the eunuch Hai Shu.
Everyone at court knew the legend. How the soothsayer bowed down before you and said, "Your Majesty, why do you lower yourself by coming to a lowly tavern like this? You have the bearing of a dragon and the ways of a phoenix. Your face is like a bright sun shining from the center of the sky. You have the gait of a tiger, and your voice peals like the bell. There is no question whatsoever that you are the true Son of Heaven."
The impact on Yongle of the soothsayer's prophecy, that he was the Son of Heaven, can today be seen in the very design and form of the Forbidden City. The emperors of China believed they were chosen by heaven to rule on earth. To Professor Geoffrey Regal, it explains why Yongle aligned his palace from south to north, directly in line with the pole star, the celestial home of the supreme deity.
The whole palace complex is built along a central axis, the axis of the world. And it's imagined that this central axis going to the north connects up with the pole star, with the North Star. The pole star is seen as important because it's the fixed star in the heavens, and all of the other celestial bodies, all of the other stars revolve around the pole star while it stays fixed in its central, powerful position. And so if one has the palace complex along this axis that is lined up with the pole star, it's the same idea. Everything in the four directions suspend from this central point represented by these palaces.
In 1398, in the capital city of Nanjing, Yongle-Le's father, the emperor, died. News soon reached the prince that his bookish nephew, Qian Wen, only 20 years old, but now with a young family, had been proclaimed the new emperor of China. In Nanjing, Qian Wen cultivated a style of government that was far removed from the warring ways of his uncle. For the new emperor, the capital Nanjing would be civil, intellectual, scholarly.
It was the largest metropolis in the wealthiest region of China. Perhaps there were about 250,000 to 350,000 people living here. Nanjing had a huge population, far larger than any city in Europe at the time. I mean, Paris and London were tiny in comparison. All the poets, all the painters, all the intellectuals, everyone you could possibly imagine would come here.
But in Yongle-Le's mind, a dynasty run by poets and painters would never last. Not when there were warring enemies like the Mongols, who eyed China hungrily. On the 13th of July, 1402, he decided to take action.
The Prince of Yen arrived here with his forces in front of these massive defenses. The genuine emperor inside thought that he was safe. The only way that the Prince of Yen could get in was through treachery, and this is exactly what happened. One of the genuine emperor's leading generals opened the gates and allowed the Prince of Yen to enter the city.
No one could forget the night Yongle, the Prince of Yen, rode into Nanjing to seize the throne. Least of all, the jailed courtier, Xie Yuanji. He was there that night, a junior minister in the imperial court. The tale he would tell over 20 years later defies belief, but it was recorded in the ancient Chinese chronicles.
The Prince of Yen was closing in. Qian Wen was pacing back and forth. We knew he was contemplating suicide. But then, a eunuch knelt down before him and told him a secret. Before, when your grandfather, the Emperor Hongwu, was about to die, he wrote you a letter and asked that it be opened only in the case of an emergency. Servants scurried to fetch the letter, which was locked inside a vermilion box. It was a plan of escape. Also inside the box were a sword, 10 ingots of gold, and a razor to shave his head.
It was an ingenious plan. The young emperor Qian Wen was to flee from the palace disguised as a Buddhist monk. No one knows for sure whether he escaped or not, but in the official account of the attack in the Ming Chronicles, Yongle claimed the Emperor Qian Wen made a gruesome decision. Rather than surrender to his uncle, he torched his own palace, condemning his family to burn. Once the flames had died, Yongle, the prince, forcibly entered the palace in Nanjing to search for the young emperor. He was ready to seize the throne, just as the soothsayer had foretold. But his nephew, Qian Wen, was nowhere to be seen. Rumors soon began to circulate that a monk, flanked by guards, had been sighted fleeing from the city. It was the last thing the prince wanted to hear. But then 3 blackened bodies were brought before him. The emperor's 6-year-old son, the empress, and the body of a young man, so charred it could not be positively identified.
I think the discovery of the charred bodies was an opportunity for the Prince of Yen, because he could legitimately say that there was no emperor and he could take over. He was the head of the family. But at the same time, it also laid out the possibility, because they could not be identified, that the Jianwen emperor had fled, and fled in disguise, and could come back to claim the throne. Therefore, he basically had to legitimate his takeover from power in many, many different ways, and he tried to force people to accept him as the emperor. And, of course, many did not, resulting in a bloodbath.
The first move Yongle made to legitimize his takeover was to demand the official sanction of China's political elite. But to him, none was more important than the empire's most respected scholar, Fang Shiru. Their conversation that day was recorded in the Ming Chronicles.
Do not cause yourself any more trouble, sir. I would like you to set a good example. The emperor, it would seem, has burnt himself to death. The country needs a ruler, a grown-up. Proclaim my succession to the empire. Only you can write it.
我是万万不会做的。
No. That is indeed regrettable.
And so it was told, and will be passed on to generations from now. Fang Xiaoru, etched on the palace floor in his own blood, just one word: usurper.
Usurper, one who steals the throne. This vile slur would dog the prince for the rest of his life. In retaliation, he purged the city of all political opponents, killing tens of thousands. Only then did he proclaim himself Yongle, the Emperor of Perpetual Happiness. But whispers that the former Emperor Qian Wen had escaped and would one day return to reclaim the throne refused to die. Yongle now understood he must wage a new war, to prove to his people that he was the one and only Emperor of China. He needed a grand new beginning and a clean reputation. First, Yongle instructed the scholars of China's Literary Academy to sugarcoat the story of the usurpation and present himself as his father's first and only choice for emperor. In the stroke of a pen, he would, quite literally, erase the reign of his predecessor from the official history. Paranoid that he might be demonized for rewriting history, Yongle decided to cover his tracks. Once the chief historian had completed his task, he was duly rewarded for his efforts and left out in the snow to die. In Nanjing, Yongle had done all in his power to stifle the opposition. But this was always going to be Qian Wen's city. If Yongle was to assert himself as the new, unassailable emperor of China, it made sense to build a new capital and a new palace where his support base was strongest.
It is time for a fresh start, don't you think? A new capital for a new emperor.
In Nanjing, those courtiers who had survived the purge gathered to hear the new emperor's shattering plan. To shift the capital of China 550 miles north to his own power base, Beiping.
I wouldn't want it said that this little building project is my decision alone. The work will no doubt be a burden on the people. It would be better if we were all in this together.
Among the groveling courtiers eager to please the formidable new emperor that day was the minister who 20 years later would be locked up in the prison outside the Forbidden City, Xie Yuanji.
Your Majesty, we sincerely believe that Beiping is the best place for a new capital. The rivers and mountains provide good defense. The water is sweet, and the soil fertile. The province of Beiping is truly the place from which Your Majesty arose. Your father was a conqueror, and he elevated the status of his hometown. Perhaps you could follow the precedent of your father and make Beiping your capital. This grand enterprise will benefit 1,000,000 generations.
And so it shall be. Beiping shall be no more. A new city, a new capital, the northern capital, Beijing.
The result of the emperor's decision that day is the heaving, smoggy metropolis of Beijing we know now. Though this was his hometown, Yongle had another, more significant reason for shifting the capital here to the north of China. It was close to the border with their Mongol enemies. Yongle wanted to build a much bigger, grander city with more people and more soldiers. But he would have to build it virtually from scratch.
It was basically built in a barren plain which had very, very few people. It had been depopulated as a result of famines, natural disasters, wars, civil wars for decades before that. And in order to build it, they had to bring together the labor and the material from all over China, from thousands of miles away.
But how was Yongle able to orchestrate what was, back then, the biggest building project of its time? You only need to look a mile from the Forbidden City at the speed and scale of construction that has taken over the central business district of today's Beijing.
This is the China World Trade Center, Tower 3. It's going to be the tallest building in Beijing when it's finished, at 74 stories. It's near the top now, it's at about 60 floors, and it'll be finished at the top within 6 weeks from now. It's quite a remarkable building, 3 million square feet, and it's here in the center of Beijing.
A staggering half of the world's steel and a third of its concrete is currently being used in the biggest metropolitan makeover on the planet. Soon, 300 more skyscrapers will create an entirely new skyline for the Chinese capital. In the time of the Emperor Yongle, millions of people and the resources of the nation were mobilized on the word of one man. Things haven't really changed.
The immediate impression is just the speed at which things are done here. We're in a centralized economy. We have a one-party state, and decisions are made quickly, and the planning process is fast. While there may not be the same level of accountability there is in the West, there certainly isn't the same amount of confusion nor delay. And China's determined that processes are not slowed down in its bid to become world economic power.
In 1406, the Emperor Yongle drew up the blueprint for his new capital. At its heart would be the vast palace complex, the Forbidden City. On 5 times as much land as today's Buckingham Palace, it would soon take its place in history as the largest palace in the world. To oversee the finances of this immense project was the minister Xie Yuanji.
I was made a minister of revenue, placed in charge of running the finances of the empire. The emperor ordered me to channel vast funds into the creation of the great gates and palaces of his new northern capital, Beijing. I responded to his call. I was unfailing in my desire to help the nation.
Helping the nation meant mobilizing over 1 million people to gather resources from every corner of the empire. Unpaid and hounded by Yongle's soldiers, workers were ordered deep into the uncharted forests of the southwest to fell giant timbers. At the mercy of pestilence, wild animals, and sheer exhaustion, it was said only half made it out alive. And up on the icy plains of the north, thousands more were dispatched to quarry stone. If materials were found to be substandard in any way, then the laborers were punished. To supply this army of workers and to ferry the materials from one end of the country to the other, Yongle ordered the development of a massive system of waterways.
In order to construct his palace, he had to build the infrastructure first. Without the infrastructure, he couldn't feed all the workers, he couldn't feed all the laborers, he couldn't feed the artisans, and he couldn't feed his army. There was no way to do it by land. It would have been far too costly, and there wasn't the road system. There was nothing there.
The solution was to command 300,000 men to redredge and extend the Grand Canal. This vast 2,500-year-old system of waterways had in the last 100 years silted up and become unnavigable.
The Yongle Emperor encouraged the opening of the Grand Canal all the way up to Beijing. It was really because of the Grand Canal and all the feeder canals that allowed China to continue and develop to be the wealthiest empire in the world.
The main rivers of China fed into the Grand Canal, which once it was reopened flowed for an incredible 1,100 miles. Yongle would create the longest man-made waterway in the world, all the way to Beijing.
The emperor ordered me out on an imperial inspection to punish any idle workers I could find with the full weight of the law. For this task, he provided me with a full contingent of the Imperial Guard. Conditions were harsh, and I feared the people could never withstand them and would be falsely accused of laziness.
To supervise the construction, Yongle would need a whole new tier of managers. In Nanjing, a team of eunuchs was recording the exact dimensions of every brick, every pillar, and every stair of the old palace. so that the new palace could be built even larger and more magnificent. For Yongle, the eunuchs were the perfect lackeys. It was said they would slavishly do the bidding of any emperor.
A eunuch is a man who has been emasculated, has lost or had his balls, his genitalia cut off. And the whole point of that is that the eunuch cannot have his own children. Therefore, his loyalty will be to the person who employs him. In other words, the Yongle emperor.
No one knows when or where Yongle's most trusted eunuch, Hai Shu, was castrated. Only that in all likelihood, he was a teenaged boy. The young men who underwent the operation were most often escorted by a guarantor, who would witness the operation and pay the castrator. It was a dangerous procedure. In addition to the excruciating pain, once both the penis and the scrotum had been sliced off, there was an extremely high chance of excessive bleeding and urinary infection. If they survived, healing could take months. The eunuch's so-called treasure parts were kept in a jar and prized as proof of their unflinching loyalty. Though no longer a man, the eunuch could enjoy a life of untold privilege and wealth. As the Ming chronicles reveal, for those such as Yongle's adoring servant Hai Shu, it was worth the sacrifice.
Any slight mistake we might ever make as a eunuch was watched carefully, and you made certain that we receive the appropriate punishment. Mindful of the mistakes of previous generations, you always protected those who were loyal to you and treated us honestly. But if we slipped up, you never failed to point it out until we rectify it. If we didn't do so immediately, we might lose everything: our house, our benefits, even if we had accumulated merit in the past. But if we served you well, the rewards.
It appears to us that that Yongle placed more trust in his eunuchs than he did in virtually any other members of the imperial court, and to be favored that way by the emperor was of enormous benefit, not only to Hai Shu, but to his entire family.
Yongle's forbidden city would one day be staffed by a shadow government of more than 3,000 eunuchs. They were entrusted not just to supervise the construction of the palace, but to fill it with sumptuous fittings and furnishings. Over 1/4 of the palace would be given over to housing the most exquisite treasure of all: women. In 1408, the eunuch Hai Shu was sent on an imperial mission to Korea to demand for the emperor's new palace silks, cloth, furs, and virgins.
Korea, you sent us there to tell the king to offer up his most beautiful girls. He kowtowed before us and said, "I don't dare refuse to do my utmost to fulfill His Majesty's wishes." He sent his officials across the land to select virgins, impoverished ones, those from good families, no matter. Any pretty ones had to be reported. None were to be allowed to get away. Anyone who hid their daughters or cut their hair off to make them look ugly was arrested and deprived of their possessions. Then, the girls were brought before us at the palace.
One of the young virgins brought before Haishu was the teenaged daughter of a Korean government official. Years later, in the Forbidden City, she'd remember that day as if it was yesterday. Her name was Lady Chui.
We were all beautiful virgins, and all between the ages of 13 and 25. I was so nervous that day. We stood there neatly, in lines of 100, all arranged by height, so that the Emperor's eunuchs could inspect us.
Show me your hand. Turn over. Your teeth. Hand.
It must be a terrifying process to go through. I don't think the woman had much say in those days. If their father decided that they wanted their daughter to be the concubine, they had no say.
Open. Open!
And they have to be beautiful, have to be young. They also have auspicious looks. For example, a woman if a woman got very short upper lips or very thin earlobe, that's not an auspicious sign. That's not good. Chinese women don't have a strong odor as Westerners, but they think it's very bad if they have bad odor from under their underarms. Those ones certainly not good enough. Those who at night snore, who would fart, who would talk, dribble, so that's not good.
Whittled down to the final 10, the remaining girls were taken off for a thorough internal examination by senior palace women. As the ancient texts make clear, only the purest young ladies would be shipped away to a new life of unimaginable luxury.
On the third day, the eunuchs went round, measuring our hands and our feet. Then we were made to walk round and round so they could observe our style. Of the 300 girls that were brought in, just 5 of us were selected.
With the other 4 girls, Lady Chui was transported 600 miles to China to enter the emperor's new harem. She would never see her home again. Until the Forbidden City was completed, Lady Chui would be kept in the old imperial palace in Nanjing. The novice concubine had much to learn.
May I leave the palace ever? See what is outside.
There is no need. Any request you should have for clothes, food, gold will be met. Though, you should firstly be reported to the eunuch in charge of the imperial life here in the palace. The appropriate official will...
Officials?
Also eunuchs. They will be dispatched to verify your requests. Once your request is verified, you may collect your things from the imperial treasuries. And don't trifle with procedures. If a eunuch fails to verify and double-check one of your requests, he will be sentenced to death.
The eunuch Haishu was not joking. Precise rules governing every aspect of life in the palace are recorded in detail in the Ming Chronicles, known as the Ancestral Instructions.
What if I should fall ill? May I summon a doctor into the palace?
Palace people cannot summon for a doctor. It is up to the official of the Imperial Medicine Bureau. They will assess the symptoms and summon the appropriate doctor. Then they, together with 3 eunuchs, 2 old maids, they will accompany the doctor into the palace to view the patient. If the eunuchs and officials do not accompany him in, and only the old maids lead him in, then the supervising official, guarding officer, bureau official are all to be beheaded.
If Lady Chui was to survive in this dangerous world, she could not afford to make one false move. But if she could catch the eye of the emperor, she could become a woman of great wealth and great power.
Throughout history, there were some concubines who become very powerful, successful. One lives in hope in those days too. You would hope you will be favored by the emperor, and you will produce an heir. Once you get to that stage, you will be given a huge amount of money, and you have enormous power. All your families will given titles and the glory for the whole family.
While Lady Cui was being initiated into palace life, the actual construction of the Forbidden City had begun in Beijing. For over 10 years, raw materials from all over China had been flooding into Yongle's new capital, including the timbers of the giant hardwoods that had been felled 1,000 miles away in the forests of Sichuan.
Obviously, an important feature of the architecture of the palaces, indeed of all of the buildings within this complex, are the columns that support these very heavy roofs covered with tiles. But like everything else in the Forbidden City, these columns tell a story.
The story they tell is of an incredible journey. Rolled down mountain gullies by teams of woodcutters, then floated nearly 1,000 miles along the rivers and canals of China's extensive new water system. Each timber had taken an astonishing 4 years to reach Beijing. The chroniclers of the Ming court were awestruck.
The great timbers caused down the waters of the rivers and canals. In the dead of night, they made a sound like thunder. In one place, there was a gigantic rock blocking their path. So strong was the wood that it split the rock in two and flowed through the middle without the slightest damage to itself. The emperor thought this was done with divine help, and so he named the place where it happened Divine Wood Mountain.
Up to 380,000 timbers were soon piled high in vast lumber yards. By 1417, it had been over 10 years since Yongle decided to build the Forbidden City. Now, 100,000 craftsmen and engineers convened on Beijing, ready for the main phase of construction. Today, in the Forbidden City, officials are working on a massive £900 million restoration of the palace. They have discovered something strange. At 8 meters, the foundations for these wooden buildings are far deeper than they need to be. Professor Jeffrey Regal is keen to ask curator Li Qiping why.
A popular explanation of why the foundations are so large and so deep has been that emperors in general, and perhaps the Yongle emperor in particular, was extremely worried, one might almost say paranoid, about the possibility of people tunneling into the Forbidden City and thus trying to assassinate him.
那么我想应该倒过来说话，历史上有多少皇帝是被人盗洞杀死的呢？往往是在光天化日下或者被偷袭死亡的，远远要高于盗洞的。
对。
所以我觉得这个是一个得不偿失的说法。如果仅仅为了这个。
But Mr. Li has come up with an alternative theory for the deep foundations. In the time of Yongle, there were major earthquakes at least once every 10 years.
因为像地震，咱们都知道，地震从中心它的中心点向外传播的时候，首先是一个横向的冲击波，对吧？对。那么它是横向的推力，对。因为它的榫卯结构都是拉在一起的，就好比咱们几个人都跨在一起，对。那么就不容易被冲倒。如果你一个人可能一下就被冲倒了，对。可是几个人跨在一起就不容易被冲倒，对。那么等这个力量过去以后，才是上下的颠簸，因为它是一个传导过程嘛，对，波动嘛，对。所以这样它上下电，这样呢，它榫卯结构解决了第一项冲击，然后上下的电，因为它有一个很好的基础，对，所以它就把这些都给化解了。
Once the foundations were laid, it took just 3 years to erect nearly 1,000 buildings. Audience halls, temples, offices, and residences. All made of interconnected wooden columns and beams, and without a single nail being used. And once the walls and roofs were up, the artisans could get going on 180 acres of flooring. "640 miles from Beijing, in the city of Suzhou, one of the factories that made over 100 million bricks for Yungle's Grand Palace is still making them in exactly the same way today.
This says, 明代雍乐皇帝四名御药. So the Ming Dynasty Emperor Yongle bestowed the name Imperial Ceramic Workshops.
All the paving stones outside in the courtyards of the Forbidden City and inside the audience halls were made by hand, or rather by feet. They were then fired in kilns that in 6 centuries have never ceased production.
迁都北京的时候，建造了北京的故宫。
这个从什么时候来的？这个
窑呢是那个窑子皇帝。
I see. This kiln has been in continuous operation for about 600 years. That's really amazing. And in each firing, there are about 5,000 bricks. And the basic material that is used to bake the bricks is the husks of the rice grain.
The paving stones and bricks are fired for 2 weeks, after which water is slowly leaked from above to cool them down, changing them in colour from red to black. Yongle had them laid in every main hall and palace in the Forbidden City. The paving stones for the grand halls had to conform to exact specifications. They were, and still are, smoothed, trimmed, and measured to an exact 73.26 centimetre square.
The quality obviously had to be absolutely top-notch. Otherwise, it simply wouldn't have been accepted by the imperial authorities. And needless to say, this was intended to last forever.
The woodcutter, the boatman, the brickmaker, the craftsman, 1 million people in all, had devoted the best part of 15 years' toil and taxes to building Yongle's palace. The architectural expression of one man's desperation to legitimize his rule.
The people were exhausted. Great numbers had defected from the work gangs that felled the timber and quarried the stone. It seemed to me that after their years of building the emperor's palaces, now at last was the time to alleviate their suffering, to exempt them from yet more taxes, to let them recover their livelihood and return to their homes.
But the emperor refused to let up the pressure on his people just yet. He had decided to unveil his architectural wonder to the world in a grand opening ceremony just a few weeks later, on New Year's Day, 1421. He had already stowed away the finest treasures of the realm in their own lavish quarters at the back of the palace, the imperial harem. The Forbidden City had room enough for hundreds of concubines, so many so that some might never even meet the emperor. No one knows when Lady Cui was first summoned to Yongle's bedchamber. Only that from that time on, she became one of his great loves.
The harem was highly ritualized. There was a ritual calendar to ensure that the emperor was having sexual relations with the right woman on the right day. There were astrological reasons why certain women would be chosen on particular days, having to do with the sounds of their surnames, having to do with the circumstances of their birth. It's important because the integrity of the person of the emperor was important, but also he is, after all, the son of heaven, right? He's a spiritual being in a sense, and so his having sex isn't just having sex. There are cosmic implications for all of this.
You know, must be a terrifying experience for a young girl to be taken by the emperor for the first time. You know, the emperor behaved like he was above the human beings. But I think she also knew that was one of her real chance to please the emperor, to become a favorite. Concubines, when they first arrive, they were very young girls, normally in their teenagers. So they will be enlightened, the art of lovemaking, or the rain of cloud, as it is referred to politely in Chinese. And they will be showing, there were textbooks, and there were also erotic paintings to show them how to do that.
Set adrift in a sea of silk and finery, young virgins like Lady Cui had no idea they were pawns in a much bigger game. Their role was not just to provide the emperor with offspring. In the eyes of the court and in the eyes of heaven, it was their purity and impeccable behavior that would bring balance and harmony to the new heart of the empire, the Forbidden City. But ignorance is bliss, and no more so when you are made to wait on a comfortable bed for the emperor to show.
Women and the emperor are as the left hand is to the right. From the time you get up to the time you go to bed, your only duty is to love me. If you serve the emperor well, then the whole country will prosper. But you must always be honest with me. It will keep you here. It will keep you alive. The woman who is not careful will see her reputation destroyed. And then only disaster can result.
Disaster would come, but not just yet. Keeping it at bay had become a preoccupation of Yungla's reign. Having snatched the throne himself so violently, he now festooned the palace with the final flourishes, talismans to ward off evil.
Typically, one finds at the ends of the corners of the roof mythical beasts. There's a kind of horned dragon behind, and then another mythical figure seated on an animal. But the ones that interest us are those 5 seated animals. They represent good luck and good fortune because it's the odd numbers in Chinese numerology. It's the odd numbers that are the magic numbers, 5, 7, 9. In the duality that informs almost all of Chinese metaphysical or cosmological thought, the duality that we call yin and yang, the female and the male, the dark and the bright, autumn and spring, all of these dualities, the odd numbers are on the yang side of the equation. And associating the building then with the yang helps to keep evil away. "15 years after he first announced his decision to shift the capital to Beijing,
the emperor was at last ready to present the Forbidden City to the world. 200 years before Versailles was built, and 300 years before Buckingham Palace, thousands of foreign dignitaries were invited to Beijing to see the Forbidden City. The sight that greeted them was quite simply jaw-dropping. The visitors would be made to walk half a mile through a succession of giant gates that culminated in the towering three-sided Meridian Gate. Only then would they be admitted into the vast ceremonial plazas that spread before the Hall of Supreme Harmony. Even then, half of the palace complex was kept off limits. No one but the emperor and his entourage of eunuchs could be admitted to the cloistered world of the imperial harem. Everything, it seemed, augured well. Even the day picked for the opening ceremony was of the highest astrological significance, the Jiazi Day.
The Chinese calendar is organized upon a 60-day and a 60-year cycle. And the beginning of that cycle, which is known as the Jiazi Day, is the most auspicious day in the entire cycle. That showed that he was beginning a new era, and he was the one who was controlling the cycles of time.
This was the culmination of Yongle's reign. Eyewitness accounts would celebrate the glory of his finest hour.
There gathered 300,000 men and women, while nearly 2,000 musicians stood, singing in concert and chanting the praises of the emperor.
They began to strike on drums and played upon trumpets, cymbals, flutes, and conch shells. Then the three doors were flung open and the people rushed inside.
At the foot of his throne, they paid homage to His Majesty, the one true Son of Heaven.
At the top of the stairway stood the Yongle Emperor himself, flanked by his consorts, his concubines, his favorites, members of the court, members of the bureaucracy, members of the imperial family, all there to celebrate the moment, while we here, standing in the courtyard below him, would face him and then carefully kneel down and knock our heads upon the ground 3 times to signal our reverence not only for heaven, but for the emperor himself. To be able to stand at the top of that terrace and look down, and to have this large audience in front of him congratulating him on what he had accomplished must have been for him personally a signal that what he had done was right. The success in and of itself was a mark that heaven approved of what he had done.
But the blessing of heaven could not be counted on for much longer. In the coming weeks, outside the palace walls, the city of Beijing continued to host the thousands of foreign ambassadors who had journeyed so far for the opening ceremony. But inside the Forbidden City, its residents began to luxuriate in their new surroundings. Beautiful, Delicate and seemingly carefree, the concubines had never known such opulence. The Ming records tell how departments run by eunuchs catered to their every whim. There was a department of entertainment for festivals and parties, a directorate of outfitting, providing tents, cushions and tablecloths, an imperial wine room, a bureau of silverware, a department of the bathhouse to provide them with steaming water. There was even a department of toilet paper. But that wasn't all. For years now, the vassal states around China and far beyond had paid homage to the empire by giving gifts. By far the most exotic, as the courtier Xie Yuanji remembered, was the giraffe, now living in the palace menagerie. Long believed to be a mythical beast akin to the unicorn, the Qilin.
An envoy from Bengal came to the court and presented to the emperor an extraordinary gift, a Qilin. The court was all in a flutter. Its visage was mystical and divine. Its magical fur shiny and clean. Its star-like pupil dazzled the eye. We all knew that the Qilin was an extraordinary animal that was said would appear only if a sagely emperor was on the throne. This is why barbarians had climbed mountains and crossed oceans to bring this offering to China.
But for the concubines, it was a cloistered playground. Though they wanted for nothing, they were never to leave the Forbidden City. Caged inside, some developed what were known as vegetarian affairs with the eunuchs.
I think probably in many cases there was a very close connection between the eunuchs and the concubines. These eunuchs looked after every physical desire that they could possibly want. And since it was very unlikely that they had very much contact with the emperor, these were the only men, or half men, that they would have contact with. So it's not surprising at all that they would build up emotional relationships with these individuals, which of course, if they went too far, that could lead to trouble for themselves and their eunuch handlers.
But tragically, it wasn't all fun and games. In 1420, the paranoid emperor had created a monstrous secret police machine known as the Eastern Depot to advise him of any threat to the throne. It was run by senior eunuchs who would spy on everyone, even their own kind. The official Ming texts make no mention of what his spies discovered, but buried away in a little-known account of the time, written by envoys from Korea, the native land of the concubine Lady Chui, is a spine-tingling tale. In the days immediately after the opening ceremony, with China's foreign guests still all camped out in the city, word was dispatched to Yongle that one of his favorite concubines had been caught cavorting with a eunuch.
The emperor flew into a rage. He rounded up all the servants and had them questioned. They were terrified. They began to babble that they were guilty and they were cooking up a plot to have him killed. Only one man had the courage to stand up to the emperor. Right to his face, he said, "I am old and weak, and when I was young, I was a monk. Why should I now be blamed?" But his cries fell on deaf ears.
If indeed there was some kind of liaison going on between eunuchs and concubines, this threatened the manhood of the emperor, but also posed a political threat to him. And it is not therefore surprising that if this got out of hand, then the emperor would be extremely angry and would take immediate action.
Away from prying eyes, the emperor did not hesitate to act. So the Korean chronicles tell, the concubines were quietly rounded up from their residences at the back of the palace and marched to their death.
One of the palace ladies, Lady Huang, desperately tried to save herself by implicating a number of others. My good friend, Lady Li, who was far more collected than she was, told her, "When you know you're going to die, why do you want to take others with you?" "I shall die alone," she said. And she did, without blaming a soul. Altogether, 2,800 palace ladies, servants, and eunuchs were executed that day.
How the concubines were executed is described in the Korean chronicles as Chinlin Guo-jer. The words are hard to translate exactly, but they mean rent, ripped, split, torn to shreds. There is no mention of the massacre in Yungle's own official records. It seems so soon after the fanfare of the opening ceremony, he did his best to sweep the whole sordid affair under the carpet.
When you have ambassadors from 60 or more countries around and they're there for 5 months, then the emperor has to show that he's in complete charge of his palace. And any whiff of scandal could cause serious trouble. They would have tried to suppress all news about this and would have not wanted a single word to have leaked out.
But news did leak out to envoys from Korea that many of their countrywomen had been murdered. Lady Chui had been spared only because she was ill and had been recuperating in the old palace at Nanjing. But fortune would not look so favorably on the emperor for what he had done. Just 100 days after the opening ceremony, something unearthly was about to strike at the very core of his beloved palace, the 3 main halls of the Forbidden City.
The largest of the 3, at the southern end of the platform, is the Basilica for Revering Heaven. Behind it, in the middle, is a smaller building that he called the Floriate Canopy. and behind it, further still, that is at the northern end of this platform, is the Basilica for. It's difficult to translate these things. Is the Basilica for being mindful of one's person. It refers really, I think, to a kind of moral cultivation and communicates the message that the emperor was not only concerned with the morality of his empire at large, but with his own behavior. If you had a bird's eye view of these three palaces, you'd see that the three buildings together seem to form the Chinese character Tu, written like this. This is the character that stands for the word that means earth. The reason for this, we think, is that then the three buildings taken together symbolize earth, but earth as a cosmic force at the center of the universe.
If these three buildings were Jungla's direct link to heaven, then it is no surprise that those such as Lady Chui interpreted what happened the very night after the massacre as the vengeance of the gods.
There was such deep sorrow in the palace that thunder shook the three great halls in the Forbidden City. Lightning struck them. And after all those years of toil, they burned to the ground.
The blaze lit up the entire city. So the words of the ancient texts record. Flames engulfed the wooden beams and pillars of the palace as if 100,000 torches had been lit. Leaping from the main halls to the parlors and chambers behind, reducing 250 buildings to ashes, burning scores of men and women alive.
因为地必巨大天变, and they all burnt to the ground. All within the palace were overjoyed by this event, thinking that the emperor would surely be frightened by this change wrought by heaven. 地不以为戒.
We all hoped the emperor would see what this was. A warning that he should change his ways, that he should cease his cruelty. But he did not. He could not. He continued to be cruel. He could not change. Not now.
After lightning struck the three palaces and they burnt to the ground, Jungla issued a statement in which he worried about his government and questioned why this great catastrophe had happened. This statement begins with a remarkable confession. He says, 真心惶惧. I am frightened to the very core of my being, and I don't know what to do. 与今天是神之名，愿所待。
I humbly bow to heaven's will. The three great halls of my palace lie in ashes. In my heart I am lost. I am shaken and fearful. It was always my intention to respect heaven and to worship the gods. Have I now failed you?
Not knowing what to do, he then asks aloud, rhetorically if you like, a number of questions. 译者,
has my rule gone astray? Have I let corrupt men hold power while the worthy have hidden away so that I can no longer distinguish between the good and the evil? Have my punishments been too harsh
Did I punish those who were not guilty? Did I oppress my people and bring about this disaster, depriving them of the right to work for themselves? Have I taxed them too heavily, worked them too hard, demanded too much so that their strength has been exhausted? I've been blind. I have been blind.
Yongle had clawed his way to the dizzy heights of power. Now he'd sunk to the lowest point of his reign. The palace that he had covered with lucky charms seemed damned. The coffers were empty, but unwisely, he sought a solution in the one thing he did best: war. A new campaign against the Mongols up to the north of China would prove to his people he was still their indefatigable leader.
We must quickly find a remedy to the situation. Try to change ourselves and go back to fulfilling Heaven's intention. Minister, is there silver enough in the treasury for war?
Sire, I have received great favors from your majesty, and so I cannot fail to admonish you, even on pain of death. So many misfortunes and faults have befallen us in such swift succession. Your people are exhausted. Even your majesty has had little opportunity to rest. Sir, you are unwell. I beg of you, if you must have a war, send your generals on this campaign, but do not go yourself.
Put the Minister of Revenue in the care of the Directorate of the Palace Eunuchs. Confiscate his property. Leave each member of his family with one cotton suit and something to eat with.
It's really quite extraordinary that you could have officials who could stand up and be willing to criticize to his face a man of that power and that perseverance, knowing full well that he had just to wink his eye and your life could be ended.
Right from the start, the loyal minister, Xie Yuanji, had thrown his full weight behind the emperor's colossal building project. Now, for daring to speak out, he was flung into the prison run by Yongle's eunuch secret police. These are his words.
And so, here I am. From time to time, the emperor sends in a eunuch to check up on me. Sometimes they ask, the emperor used to treat you so well, but now he imprisons you and treats you so severely. Don't you resent him? And I reply, wind, rain, frost, and dew, they all just teach you to be better men.
Up on the Mongolian border, the emperor's army prepared for war. But the sneaking belief that heaven had forsaken him had left Yongle a broken man. He had run out of energy and run out of faith. In desperation, he turned to mystical medicines, musks and long now, to cure his sickened soul. It made no difference. On the 12th of August, 1424, Yongle, the third emperor of the Ming dynasty, died.
If, as the records suggest, the illness follows closely upon the fires. I think he, in a way, internalized all of that. He did hold himself responsible for what happened, and I think that the reflection, the sort of self-investigation, the self-questioning, the self-doubt, all of that, I think, led to a kind of psychological imbalance, and so the illness was just a physical manifestation of this doubt.
The eunuch Hai Shu brought the emperor's body back to the Forbidden City to dress and prepare him for burial in the great Ming tombs that had been specially constructed outside Beijing. Yongle had usurped the throne, but assured the rise of the dynasty. He is today remembered as both the best and the worst of imperial China, a tireless overachiever and a despotic tyrant.
够了，退后。
In the dark world of the Forbidden City, where life could be snuffed out in an instant, Lady Cui had successfully outlived her husband, the emperor. But there is a sickening footnote in the marriage vows of the favored imperial concubine. She must never give herself to another man.
I think throughout history there were different rules regarding this issue. Before, when the emperor died, his concubines were forced to shave off their hair and to become nuns in a monastery. But in some cases, a woman asked to kill themselves or to be buried together to serve him in the afterlife.
Lady Cui had been preparing herself all day to meet her husband one last time, in death. Along with Yongle's 15 favorite concubines and their servant girls, she was escorted to a quiet hall in the Forbidden City, where nooses of white silk had been hung from the painted timbers. She was just 30 years old. After Yongle's death, his son, the new emperor, Hongxi, decided to abandon the ill-fated palace and move the capital back to Nanjing. But before he could, just 1 year into his reign, he died. The palace, it seemed, was cursed. The 3 great halls lay in ruins for 15 years, until the decision was taken to rebuild them. The Forbidden City would serve in total 24 emperors, until 1911, when revolutionaries stormed the palace to end imperial rule. When Yongle opened the Forbidden City, he showcased the might of his empire and dazzled the world. Now, after 600 years, with the coming Olympics, all eyes are turning to Beijing once more. China, the new superpower, is commanding the world's attention once again.